CJ plays video games to block out a painful reality. His mom will never walk through the door again.
Look down at your heart, and your mama will always be right there for you. You want to say something to her, look down at your heart. And whatever you say to her, say it to her right there. The same way I have to do. I have to look right here, and I have to talk to her and ask her, just tell me what happened.
Instead of planning her 6-year-old grandson's birthday, Tina McMiller shared the last note Romeeca Blackman left for her son.
And then she wrote him a note in his lunchbox. And on the back of the note, he responded and said, I love you more, Mom.
The 31-year-old mom was shot and killed just after dropping her son off at school near Cermak State in the South Loop. She had gotten into a fight with another woman. Both of them share a child with the same man who lives nearby. He was also at that scene. That other woman, also 31, shot Blackman 3 times. One bullet struck her in the face.
Got a female black, light complexion, green tracksuit, has a gun, fighting with another female black, dark complexion.
The shooter stayed on the scene, and as you can see, a witness pointed out the shooter to police.
She shot her!
One of the witnesses also said the father of Blackman's child had her in a headlock before the shots were fired.
I'm licensed to carry.
It doesn't matter. You shot somebody. What the wrong with you?
The man in the shorts is CJ's father. He's covered in blood.
How did she just walk away? How? When they told you that he had her in the headlock, how did he even walk away? Why did they was so easy to walk away? They tell me, look at the video, they bumping fences. I don't know about any of that because I really can't even focus.
Court records show the shooter had filed multiple protective orders against Blackman starting last December and as recently as this summer. The family believes she was trying to build a paper trail.
That's a game that was played and it was premeditated.
The shooter was taken into custody but later released. Blackman's family says she was unarmed. Witness video also shows Blackman's white car stopped in the street, but it's unclear how she got out. They insist there was no reason to shoot her. Blackman worked 2 jobs and was studying to become a registered nurse. Her school awarded her mom a pin posthumously.
You had an opportunity to walk away, to call the police, to turn around and get in your car and drive off. You did none of the above.
The Cook County State's Attorney's Office did release a statement. After an initial review of the evidence presented by police, there's insufficient information to make a charging decision at this time. We will continue working with the Chicago Police Department as the investigation proceeds and remain committed to pursuing justice for everyone in our communities. Blackman's family says they know they can't hear her voice again, but want to hear from those that will make a decision on this case.
Not one call, nothing from the state's attorney at all.
There is a moment in many criminal investigations when the entire narrative shifts. Not because of a dramatic confession, not because of a new piece of physical evidence, but because someone who once stood silently on the edge of the story suddenly steps forward and begins to speak. Sometimes that voice belongs to a stranger. Sometimes it belongs to a witness who had always been there. And sometimes, far more disturbingly, that voice belongs to someone who once shared a life with the victim. In the investigation surrounding the death of Romeeca Meeks, investigators would eventually reach such a moment. It did not happen at the crime scene. It did not happen during the first wave of police interviews. It happened later, inside a courtroom where words suddenly carried the weight of irreversible consequence. That was the moment when testimony connected to Carlos Meeks began to reshape the way prosecutors, defense attorneys, and even observers in the gallery understood what might have been unfolding long before the shooting ever occurred. But the significance of that testimony could only be understood by going backward, long before the courtroom, long before the investigation, to a quieter world where daily routines still held the illusion of stability. I want to welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. To understand why that courtroom moment carried such gravity, investigators first had to understand the emotional landscape that existed before it. The public often imagines criminal cases as sudden eruptions of violence. One moment, everything is normal. The next moment, tragedy explodes into view. But real life rarely follows that kind of dramatic simplicity. Real life unfolds through patterns, relationships, and quiet decisions that accumulate slowly over time. And in this case, the patterns surrounding Romeeca Meeks revealed a woman whose life was defined not by chaos, but by routine. And those who knew her described a person who valued stability, a person who believed in the quiet promises of ordinary life, the kind of promises that rarely make headlines, the promise that tomorrow will look a lot like today, the promise that the people who stand beside you today will still be there tomorrow. For Romeeca, that sense of continuity mattered deeply. Friends would later recall that she believed strongly in the idea of building something steady, relationships that lasted. He had routines that anchored daily life, connections that held families together even when life became complicated. And life inevitably always becomes complicated, because behind every stable routine lies the fragile truth that relationships are not static structures. They are living systems, constantly adjusting to pressures that often remain invisible until something breaks. Over time, investigators would begin to see those pressures emerge in the story surrounding Romeeca's life. Not as dramatic confrontations, not as explosive arguments, but as subtle shifts that, in hindsight, seemed to suggest something was quietly changing. At the center of those shifts was the relationship dynamic involving Carlos Meeks. Relationships are rarely simple, and those who attempt to reduce them to a single narrative often miss the complexity that defines real human connections. The bond between two people can hold affection, loyalty, frustration, distance, and unresolved tension all at the same time. Those who later tried to reconstruct the emotional landscape surrounding Romeeca and Carlos would find themselves navigating exactly that kind of complexity. There were moments of closeness, moments of shared routine, moments when life appeared outwardly ordinary, but investigators would eventually learn that within that ordinary structure, other dynamics were also beginning to form. One of those dynamics involved another name that would later appear repeatedly in testimony and investigative records: Holly Quadajah Johnson. At first, the connection seemed simple. People cross paths every day. Friendships form, relationships evolve. Lives intersect in ways that appear harmless on the surface. But the deeper investigators looked into the timeline surrounding these individuals, the more they realized that understanding the emotional connections between them would be essential to understanding the events that eventually led to a courtroom filled with unanswered questions. It is important to recognize something here that often gets lost in public discussions of criminal cases. Human relationships do not move in straight lines. They shift gradually. They drift. Sometimes they fracture quietly without anyone outside the relationship noticing the change. In many cases, those involved may not even recognize the full extent of those shifts themselves until the consequences become impossible to ignore. And so investigators began looking at patterns, phone records, messages, movements, not searching for a single dramatic moment, but for a sequence of choices that might reveal how the emotional landscape between these individuals had evolved. What they found was not a single revelation, but a pattern of interactions that slowly began to suggest something deeper than coincidence. In the months leading up to the events that would eventually bring the case into the public spotlight, communication patterns involving Carlos appeared to shift. Contacts increased with certain individuals. Conversations lengthened. Investigators studying those patterns did not immediately assign meaning to them. Patterns alone do not explain motive, but patterns often reveal attention. And attention, in human relationships, is rarely neutral. It is directed somewhere. Over time, those patterns pointed repeatedly toward Holly Quadajah Johnson. To outsiders, this might have seemed like a simple development, two people communicating, perhaps building a friendship. But investigators studying relationship dynamics know that changes in attention often correspond with changes in emotional investment. And emotional investment, once redirected, it can alter the structure of existing relationships in subtle but powerful ways. The question that slowly began forming among investigators was not simply whether communication existed between Carlos and Holly. The question was what those communications meant within the broader context of the relationship surrounding Romeeca. Because every relationship operates within an emotional ecosystem. When energy flows toward one connection, it inevitably changes the balance of another. Friends of Romeeca would later recall small moments that, at the time, did not seem alarming. Slight changes in mood, conversations that felt shorter than they once had been, the kind of subtle distance that can develop between two people long before anyone openly acknowledges that distance exists. None of those moments by themselves indicated something dangerous. But when investigators reconstruct the timeline of a case, they are not looking for isolated events. They are looking for patterns that suggest movement beneath the surface. And the movement they began to see suggested that emotional loyalties within this circle of relationships might have been shifting. It would take months before that possibility would become central to the prosecution's theory of the case. But the seeds of that theory began forming early in the investigation. Because once violence enters a story, investigators must ask a difficult question: what changed? Violence rarely appears without context. It grows from decisions, emotions, and conflicts that existed long before the final moment. Understanding those conditions became the central challenge of the investigation surrounding Romeeca Meeks. At first, investigators approached the case the way they approach many violent crimes, by focusing on the immediate evidence, the scene, the timeline, the physical details that could establish what happened in the moments surrounding the shooting. But as the investigation expanded, it became increasingly clear that the answers investigators were searching for might not exist solely within those final moments. They might exist within the emotional history of the relationships involved. And that realization brought renewed attention to the interactions between Carlos and Holly Quadajah Johnson. Observers outside the investigation often assume that detectives immediately recognize the significance of every relationship in a case. In reality, in understanding those dynamics takes time. People rarely present their emotional lives openly during early interviews. They minimize conflicts. They protect reputations. They frame events in ways that reflect the version of reality they are most comfortable with. Detectives know this. That is why they return to the same conversations again and again, slowly comparing statements against evidence, searching for contradictions that might reveal deeper truths. In the early stages of the investigation, statements involving Carlos did not immediately stand out. He described events, answered questions, and participated in the process the way many individuals connected to a case do. But over time, as additional information surfaced, investigators began noticing moments where the narrative surrounding the relationships involved seemed incomplete. Details that appeared minor at first began gaining significance when viewed alongside communication records and timelines. And the result was not a sudden revelation, but a growing sense that the emotional dynamics within this story were more complex than initial interviews had suggested. That complexity would eventually reach its most visible moment inside a courtroom. Because when the case moved forward and testimony began unfolding under oath, the story that had once existed only within investigative files began to take shape in public view. And that was when the role of Carlos Meeks and the connections involving Holly Quadajah Johnson would begin to attract intense scrutiny. Observers in the courtroom would later recall the quiet tension that filled the room during those moments. Courtrooms are strange environments. They are places where lives are dissected through testimony, where memories are examined under the strict structure of legal questioning. Words spoken there carry consequences that cannot be easily undone. And on that day, the testimony connected to Carlos began revealing details that forced everyone listening to reconsider how the relationships within this case had evolved. The prosecution's questions moved carefully. They did not accuse immediately. Instead, they built a narrative piece by piece, establishing timelines, clarifying connections, asking about communications that had occurred months earlier. Each question added another layer to the emerging picture. A picture that suggested emotional allegiances might not have been where many had originally assumed they were. That was the moment when the investigation into the death of Romeeca Meeks shifted from a simple reconstruction of events into something more psychologically complex. Because once the courtroom began examining the emotional choices made before the tragedy, a new question emerged. A question that investigators had been quietly considering for months. If loyalties had shifted, if emotional investments had changed, what role might those changes have played in the decisions that followed? That question would not produce a single simple answer. Instead, it would open a deeper exploration into how relationships evolve under pressure, how individuals respond when emotional commitments collide, and how the quiet choices people make in private can eventually shape the public tragedies that follow. And as the testimony continued, the story surrounding Romeeca Meeks would become less about a single moment of violence and more about the invisible emotional currents that had been moving beneath the surface long before anyone realized where they might lead. The courtroom would hear about timelines, about conversations, about connections that appeared ordinary until they were examined within the context of everything that followed. And slowly, methodically, the narrative surrounding Carlos and Holly Quadajah Johnson would begin to take shape, not as a dramatic accusation, but as a sequence of human decisions whose consequences were still unfolding. But even as that testimony moved forward, one truth remained painfully constant. At the center of the entire case was the life that had been lost, the life of Romeeca Meeks, a life that had once been defined by routines, relationships, and the quiet expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. And it was that loss, more than any courtroom revelation, that continued to give the investigation its emotional weight. Because while courts seek answers and investigators seek explanations, the absence left behind by violence cannot be undone. The story, however, was far from finished. The testimony that had begun revealing new dimensions of the relationships involved would soon lead investigators and attorneys into even more difficult territory. Territory where motives would be debated, loyalties questioned, and the quiet emotional choices made long before the tragedy would become impossible to ignore. And in the days ahead, the courtroom would begin hearing evidence that forced everyone watching to confront a haunting possibility: that the path toward the violence investigators were trying to understand might have been forming slowly, quietly, long before anyone realized how dangerous it could become. Real courtrooms rarely behave that way. Instead, the atmosphere grew quieter, more attentive. Because when testimony begins touching on emotional decisions that existed before a tragedy, the people listening often realize that what they are hearing is not simply a timeline of events. They are hearing the gradual exposure of human choices, the kind of choices that often look ordinary at the time they are made, the kind that only appear significant when examined after something irreversible has already happened. As the questioning continued, attorneys focused less on isolated moments and more on patterns. Patterns of communication, patterns of movement, patterns of emotional attention. In many investigations, the most revealing evidence does not come from a single dramatic act. It comes from repetition, repeated messages, repeated meetings, repeated choices that, when viewed together, begin to outline the emotional priorities that guided someone's life before the crisis. The courtroom began hearing about those patterns. Messages exchanged during ordinary hours, conversations that appeared casual when they occurred, yet now seemed to carry a different weight when placed beside the timeline of the crime. Observers sitting in the gallery watched carefully as the prosecution moved through those details with methodical patience. They were not trying to create a sudden revelation. They were trying to show how emotional alignment can shift gradually, and how those shifts, once they occur, can alter the decisions people make when faced with pressure. The name that continued appearing in those discussions was Holly Quadajah Johnson, not as a central accusation, but as a presence within the relational landscape investigators were attempting to understand. Relationships, after all, rarely exist in isolation. They intersect with other connections, other influences, other emotional bonds that shape how individuals see their future. When those bonds begin to change, the emotional gravity within a person's life can change as well. That is what prosecutors were attempting to illustrate. They described how investigators had reconstructed the months leading up to the tragedy, not searching for confrontation, but searching for quiet shifts. Messages sent more frequently, time spent differently, emotional attention moving in directions that had not previously defined the structure of the relationship involving Romeeca Meeks. The defense, for their part, who reminded the courtroom that relationships are complicated. People communicate with many individuals throughout their lives. Patterns can be interpreted in many ways. What appears significant to one observer might appear ordinary to another. This tension between interpretation and certainty became the central rhythm of the trial. Evidence was introduced. Context was debated. Each side offered its own interpretation of the emotional landscape that existed before the shooting. But amid those competing narratives, the presence of Romeeca herself remained impossible to ignore. Witnesses spoke about her routines, about the way she moved through daily life, about the expectations she carried for the future she believed she was building. They described a woman who invested deeply in relationships, who believed in stability even when circumstances became challenging. It is often through these testimonies that the reality of loss becomes most visible. Not through dramatic descriptions, but through quiet recollections of everyday moments. A conversation in a kitchen, a phone call at the end of a long day, a simple act of kindness remembered by someone who did not realize at the time how important that memory would later become. The courtroom listened as those moments were described, and as they were described, a pattern began emerging that had little to do with courtroom strategy and everything to do with the emotional cost of violence. Because behind every legal argument stands a reality that cannot be reduced to evidence exhibits. A life that once existed is no longer there. The law seeks accountability. Investigators seek explanation. But the absence itself remains untouched by those efforts. As testimony continued, attorneys returned again and again to the question that had quietly shaped the entire investigation. Why? Not simply what happened, not simply who was present, but why the sequence of events unfolded the way it did. Motive is one of the most difficult elements to establish in any criminal case. It does not exist as a physical object investigators can collect and examine. It must be inferred from behavior, from patterns, from the emotional currents that run beneath human decisions. The prosecution suggested that those currents involve shifting loyalties and evolving emotional commitments. And the defense argued that such interpretations relied too heavily on assumptions about private feelings that could never be proven with certainty. And so the courtroom remained suspended between competing narratives. One emphasizing relational change as a possible catalyst, the other emphasizing the danger of drawing conclusions from incomplete emotional evidence. For the observers present, the experience was sobering. Trials often reveal how fragile our understanding of other people's lives can be. We assume we know the nature of the relationships around us. We assume stability where stability appears to exist. Yet beneath those assumptions, private conflicts and shifting emotions can remain hidden until an event forces them into the open. That is what had happened here. Whatever the ultimate conclusions reached by the court, the process itself revealed how quietly the foundations of relationships can change over time, how attention can move, how loyalties can evolve, and how those changes, if left unspoken, can alter the decisions people make in moments of stress or confrontation. As the trial progressed toward its later stages, the tone in the courtroom grew increasingly reflective. Witnesses had been heard. Evidence had been presented. Attorneys had outlined their interpretations of the relational dynamics that preceded the tragedy. Now the focus began shifting toward consequence. Prosecutors reminded the court that behind every debate about motive stood a simple reality. A woman's life had ended violently. A future had been erased. A family had been forced to confront a loss that no explanation could repair. The defense emphasized the importance of certainty. They urged the court to remember that criminal responsibility must rest on clear evidence rather than emotional speculation. The law, they argued, demands proof beyond doubt, not narratives constructed from interpretations of relationships. The courtroom listened carefully to both arguments, because within that tension lies the purpose of the justice system itself, to weigh evidence carefully, to resist rushing toward conclusions, and to ensure that every claim presented in the courtroom withstands scrutiny. Yet outside the legal framework, another reality remained present, the emotional gravity of the story that had unfolded. A story that began not with a crime scene, but with ordinary routines. A story that revealed how lives intersect, how relationships shift, and how decisions made quietly within those relationships can eventually shape events far beyond what anyone imagined. As the final days of testimony concluded, observers in the courtroom would later describe a sense of heaviness rather than resolution, because the trial had exposed something deeply human, not simply conflict, but the fragile nature of trust. Trust between partners, trust within families, trust that the people closest to us will continue sharing the same emotional commitments we once believed were permanent. When that trust fractures, the consequences can ripple outward in ways that no legal ruling can fully contain. In reflecting on the case, investigators themselves acknowledged how difficult it can be to trace the path from emotional tension to irreversible tragedy. Rarely does that path reveal itself clearly in the moment it begins. Instead, it forms gradually through choices that appear manageable at the time they are made. A conversation avoided, a commitment quietly redirected, a loyalty that shifts without explanation. Each of those moments may seem small, yet when they accumulate, they can alter the emotional architecture of a life. That is one of the most haunting lessons drawn from cases like this. Violence often appears sudden when viewed from the outside, but when investigators reconstruct the story afterward, they frequently discover a long trail of emotional decisions that preceded it. None of those decisions guaranteed tragedy, but together they created conditions where tragedy became possible. For those who knew Romeeca Meeks, the focus has never been solely on the courtroom debates. Their memories center on the person she was before the case ever entered public discussion, the routines she kept, the relationships she valued, the ordinary hopes she carried for the future she believed she was building. That is the part of the story that matters most. Because while legal proceedings attempt to determine responsibility, remembrance ensures that the life lost is not reduced to a case file. Romeeca was more than the circumstances surrounding her death. She was a daughter, a friend, a person who moved through the world with the same expectations most of us carry, that tomorrow would arrive with the promise of continuity rather than danger. When those expectations are shattered, communities are left searching for understanding. Not because understanding can undo what happened, but because the search itself affirms something essential, that the lives lost to violence deserve to be remembered with clarity and respect. As we reach the end of this story, the questions raised by the trial continue echoing beyond the courtroom. They remind us that silence within relationships can carry consequences just as powerful as confrontation. That emotional withdrawal, if left unaddressed, can reshape lives in ways that remain invisible until it is too late. And that the pursuit of control within personal relationships can sometimes lead individuals down paths that no one around them anticipated. But amid those reflections, one truth stands above the rest. The story of Romeeca Meeks is not defined by the tragedy that ended her life. It is defined by the life she lived before that moment arrived. The routines she built, the relationships she nurtured, the presence she left in the memories of those who knew her. Those memories endure long after the courtroom empties and the legal arguments fade. They endure because remembrance is the quiet act that restores dignity to stories shaped by loss. Thank you for spending this time with Cold Case Chronicles. If you believe in remembering victims with respect and examining the truth behind cases that still raise difficult questions, consider subscribing to the channel. And if this story moved you in any way, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and your thoughts on the case. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive, ensuring that the people at the center of them are never forgotten.